Okay. Welcome, everybody. We're about to get underway with this roundtable. We've got about a minute to let any others join, and we'll be starting when the clock ticks on to the hour. Just so you know who you're looking at on your screen, John Marinopoulos from Value Advisory Partners, myself from Monash University, Sharon Orban from Monash University, Daniel Gutman, who co-chairs the international panel for the National Academy of Public Administration, Greg Bloom, who was a co-organizer of the Miami Insurance, I'm going to get it wrong now, Greg, Insurance Strategy Forum. Shahab is the person who brings all this together. Heidi Turner is the CEO of the Townsville Chamber of Commerce and prepared a report for the Australian government that brought together 20 chambers of commerce across Northern Australia. Amanda Mullen is a project officer with the National Academy of Public Administration. Shanjib Padam from Finity is a rock star of the finance industry. He was Actuary of the Year or Insurance Person of the Year, etc. And Matt R is the head of School of Public and International Affairs and Professor of International and Public Affairs at the University of Georgia. Oren Young is a guru from the University of California at Santa Barbara, a world expert on governance. And my screen has changed, but I think next to Oren was Deborah Tan, the CEO of CWR in Hong Kong. And also on screen, you might be seeing Mark Pisano, who co-chairs the Intergovernmental Panel at the National Academy of Public Administration. Well, we've passed the starting time. So I'd like to start by letting you all know that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people who occupied and are the traditional owners of land that the City of Melbourne is now situated on, and Monash University acknowledges the Woiwurrung people, of which the Wurundjeri are a part, as well as the Boonwurrung people, so the River Valley people and the coastal people of this area where Melbourne sits today. We've got a really important topic and a really exciting panel in front of us today. Just before we get underway, I'm hoping that Sharon from the Faculty of Business and Economics or the Monash Business School could briefly give you an introduction to the Business School and Green Lab and why we're here as Green Lab.
Great.
Sharon.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, good evening and good morning wherever you are coming from today. So I'm the Research Development and Partnerships Manager here in the Business School, and the Green Lab is one of the impact labs within the Monash Business School, and it's a hub for applied and interdisciplinary research and engagement on climate and sustainability. And the lab brings together academics from a range of business disciplines, economics, accounting, finance and law, with the aim of working more closely with industry, government and civil society. One of Green Lab's research themes is optimal adaptation to climate change impacts. And the members of the lab work on understanding the impacts of climate change in different areas, such as health and wellbeing, agriculture and food security, biodiversity and natural resources, and also on contributing to the development of effective responses. Through this webinar series, Living with 2 Degrees Plus, the Green Lab is hosting a series of important conversations between experts from industry, government and academia in different areas of climate change adaptation policy. This is the third webinar in this series focused on climate disasters, and insurance is particularly topical right now as we encounter yet another range of extreme events on climate change and induced natural disasters in Australia. And public debate right now is really focused squarely on the cost of living issues, including skyrocketing insurance costs. So that's just a bit of introduction to the group.
Thanks, Sharon. That's great. And Amanda, thank you for joining us at a rather late hour. Would you like to introduce the audience to NAPA?
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. Amanda Mullen. I'm a project director at the National Academy of Public Administration, and I'm currently in Alexandria, Virginia. I want to just thank everyone for joining on behalf of my team at the Academy. I'd also like to thank Monash University and Michael Spencer for collaborating with us on this series, as well as the work and leadership on this topic from fellows Mark Pisano and Dan Gutman, as their roles of standing panels on international affairs and intergovernmental systems. This effort is very important for us to learn from other countries' approaches to address the impacts of climate change. And I'd also like to thank today the Academy Fellow Matthew Auer for participating on the panel today. We also see that James Baker, the former Undersecretary of Commerce for Atmosphere and Oceans and the former administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the Clinton administration, is also joining us today. So just wanted to especially shout out and thank him for joining the session as well. For folks who may not have heard of the Academy, it is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is chartered by Congress to leverage the experience and expertise of our over 1,000 fellows and working on issues that address all levels of government and sectors and climate adaptation. There's no bigger challenge that we have in public administration. So this is a particular interest to the Academy. I'm very excited. We will be announcing shortly that we are standing up an extreme weather resilience hub at the Academy. Very excited to be participating in that work from the Strategic Initiatives Division. The hope here today is that we find practices that work, the hope is that we find practices that work for all today. We hope to share our experiences, identify innovative approaches, and explore how others are addressing a common challenge that we have with regards to extreme weather and more frequent floods, wildfires, drought, heat, and sea level rise events. I'll also post in the chat a link to prior videos of this webinar series, as well as other reports that have been done by the fellows of the Academy. Again, just want to thank everybody today and pass it back to Michael.
Thanks, Amanda. That's fantastic. And we are talking about another series of 3 webinars to follow this. So we'll be having those discussions and letting you all know shortly. All right, let's move into the topic. And as has already been made clear, insurance has been at the forefront of discussions about climate. And so while climate changes the risk profile for physical assets as well as human and natural, the potential for loss and damage is really reflected in what we pay in insurance. So as global average temperatures rise, the scale and frequency of extreme events is increasing, and we're seeing much greater loss and damage and corresponding rises in insurance premiums. And as we'll discuss today, making some areas uninsurable. The rate of change has raised questions about the future of the industry itself, whether it can continue to function in an environment of such escalating risk, whether parts of the business need to be picked up by governments, but at what cost. The astronomical costs associated with loss and damage raise further questions about climate adaptation. Does underinvestment in adaptation increase the cost of disaster response? And does this in turn reduce our ability to invest in adaptation? So one of the questions we need to ask is, are we frequently looking through the wrong end of the telescope rather than subsidizing or placing regulatory pressure on the insurance costs? Then there's some incremental value there for sure, I'm not denying that, but are we not spending enough time focusing on the risks and managing those risks, and how can we do both? These are some of the questions that we'll canvass today as we take an exploratory journey through the world of risk value and insurance protection. As I said, we've got an outstanding panel, and I'll introduce them in turn as they come in to speak to you. A quick reminder, these roundtables are intended to help us learn, as Amanda mentioned, and based on that, we hope to advance our thinking on how we can adapt to expected climate change. The format is that the first part will be to help us learn from our panel of speakers, and then the second part will be a discussion based on your questions. So we do encourage you to participate and to lodge your questions or comments through the Q&A function on your screen. This will be monitored throughout the session. Sharon has generously offered to do that, as has Dan, and they'll be collaborating so that when we get to the discussion, they will have a good understanding of the issues you are raising. All right, without further ado, our first speaker is Matthew Auer, Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, Arch Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Matt has researched and written about the issue of risk insurance and insurability, mainly in the context of wildfire. Matt, last year you wrote about future directions for research on risk and insurance. Perhaps you could help us kick this off by framing some of the questions that you feel we need to be asking in the context of climate change, impacts, risks, and insurability. Over to you, Matt. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you also, Amanda. It's an honor to be with you. So, Michael, I think what I'll do probably is speak to that question in the context of wildfire. I think you did a really nice job of mapping out some of those questions already, so we can hone in and think about wildfire. So if you look at insured risk and loss, that is to say, claims after wildfire disasters that have been paid out by the insurance industry globally. So if we think about this over the past roughly 10 years, and we include the Los Angeles wildfires, the catastrophic wildfires that just took place in January, total insured losses exceed around $100 billion over the past 10 years. Now compare that with the prior 30 years, total insured losses due to wildfire globally, about $20 billion. So that extraordinary rocket ship increase, if you think about the trend in insured losses, has, as you've suggested, inspired some insurance companies to say, this is just not worth bearing the risk. And we need to rethink underwriting policies in these markets. So one of the big questions moving forward is it in fact the case that we will have portions of this planet, take the United States, think of any number of spots in the lower 48 as well as in Alaska, which has its own big wildfire problems, that are simply going to become uninsurable. There are all kinds of interesting knock-on effects, including the fact that in many of these markets in the US, many states, there is an insurer of last resort. So if the licensed insurers and the regular retail insurance market is not willing to insure you, there is a statute in place that dates back many decades that says, well, the state needs to oversee a separate market that will insure you. It may be more expensive, it may not be the best insurance in the world, it may just cover perils, but they have to provide that. And so what you end up with then is in a pool of insurance of last resort. The pressure on those forms of insurance in some of our states that have frequent natural disasters, really catastrophic natural disasters, is really mounted. So in California, most recently, care of the Los Angeles wildfires, the FAIR plan, which is the insurance of last resort, had to be bailed out to the tune of $1 billion. Is that the future? Is that the norm in other states? Will that be the case in Oregon and Washington and Montana and New Mexico and California and Florida with respect to, let's say, tropical storms and hurricanes? They've had similar experiences in the recent past. Is that what we're looking at? So if the insurance of last resort is also in peril, what's left? Okay, then there's the equity piece, which is important. I hope that we will get to that. I think we will today. And that is, we know with climate change that vulnerable populations are affected by climate change disproportionately. That's clearly true with insurance as well. So if you don't have affordable insurance, accessible insurance, high quality insurance, the people who pay first for that are people who are vulnerable. People who are lower income, older folks who are on fixed income, disabled people, marginalized populations, et cetera. That's another important issue. There's so many others. Michael, you mentioned, look, maybe we're looking at this through the wrong end of the telescope. The whole risk issue is important. In the United States, over the course of the 90s and the 2000s, midway into the teens of the 21st century, so over basically a 25-year period, in this country, we built more than 30 million homes in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI. That probably wasn't such a good idea. Those homes, in many cases, are the first homes that we need to really think about as being in severe wildfire zones. We have the same thing, of course, in the coastal context with tropical storms and hurricanes, sea level rise, et cetera. Similar issues. And then play that out across any number of places across the globe, including Australia, and you have an insurance crisis. There's so many more questions to consider, but those are a few.
So just on that equity question, it keeps coming back that the more affluent can take out insurance, they can move to areas that are more protected, leaving the most vulnerable. And, I had personal experience of this helping out in one of the floods here recently. All the people we were helping in the homes that were flooded were people of some sort of disadvantage. How much is that going to shift the dial in terms of social equity and access for those people? And then there are flow-on costs as well, aren't there, through welfare payments, et cetera?
Indeed. So you can see this playing out in the most recent fires in Los Angeles. Consider the contrast between Pacific Palisades and comparatively wealthy homeowners, in some cases very wealthy, versus the so-called Eaton fire in the town of Altamira, with homes that are quite valuable. We're talking about Los Angeles County, after all, but in many cases, most of the household's wealth is in the home. And we know there's a terrific study that came out recently by colleagues at UCLA that shows that Black homeowners in the Altamira context were more likely to have homes that were damaged or destroyed by the wildfire because of their proximity to the riskiest parts of the spread of that wildfire. That's not uncommon. We've seen that in other wildfire events. We've also seen it, of course, in terrible other kinds of calamities. Any number of hurricanes in the United States would be great examples of that. Hurricane Katrina, perhaps the archetype. So, to the credit of the insurance commissioner in California, there have been some efforts to try to deal with some of these equity issues, including, for example, if you are in an emergency declaration zone, as determined by the governor of the state, your home's been affected by wildfire damage or destroyed, your insurance carrier is not allowed to non-renew or cancel your insurance for at least, let's say, a year. So there are these moratoria that have been instituted by the insurance commissioner, usually a year at a time, to try to prevent people who've had their homes that have been damaged by wildfire. And that's happened over multiple occasions over the past few years in the state of California. There are other examples of as well. So a few years ago, the insurance commissioner created a program called Safer from Wildfires. Safer from Wildfires basically says your insurance carrier, if you're in a high wildfire risk zone, they need to be transparent with you. They need to notify you and tell you what your wildfire risk score is for your home as a basis for determining what your insurance premium is. And moreover, they need to tell you, hey, if you want to reduce and get a discount on your insurance premium, here are the steps you need to take. Home hardening, creating defensible space. These are all efforts to try to deal with some of these equity issues.
Okay. Fantastic, Matt. I want to bring in Sharanjit Padam here. Sharanjit is, if you like, an insider in the industry. He's an actuary and principal at Finity, where he advises insurers, banks, investors, asset owners, governments on climate risk assessment, management, strategy and reporting. He's been recognised as Actuary of the Year in 2023, Insurance Leader of the Year in 2022, and he was also, and I think this is quite important for this conversation, lead author of reports on home insurance affordability in 2022, 23 and 24. So Sharanjit, before we get into the policy issues, can you quickly explain how insurance premiums are set and how climate change influences costs? Just, what are the mechanics going on here?
Yes, so thanks, Michael. At a very high level, there's no difference between insurance and widgets, right? So you make a widget, you work out its costs of production, you add on some profit margin, and that's your price. But the subtleties come because with insurance, you don't know your costs of production until some time after you've actually sold the project. With widgets, you know up front. With insurance, you don't. And so a lot of insurance is based on trying to estimate or trying to model the costs that will come out in the future. And hence why us actuaries and mathematicians and statisticians are kind of involved in the process. Now, the other thing that to understand is, what makes up that costs. And if we can stick to home insurance, for example, as an example, primarily, especially in Australia, there are, all the disaster costs. So the perils that are covered, flood, cyclones, bushfires, and storms. Then there are non-perils costs, things like theft and other things that don't depend on the weather. Then there are the expenses of running the insurance company and making the claims. Then there is an interesting thing called your reinsurance costs. Insurers themselves buy insurance called reinsurance. There's the net cost of that. And then lastly, there's hopefully a profit margin left for the insurance company to make. So broadly, what we're seeing with climate change is it's influencing those peril costs. It's very hard because climate change is a decadal long-term effect. And I see lots of crazy studies that try to kind of detect that effect by looking at annual insurance losses. I don't think that actually tells you what's going on because we really need a lot more data to be definitive about that analysis. But broadly, what we are seeing from the insurance narrative is that these costs are increasing over time. A large part of disaster costs, when you look at them overall, are increasing because we just basically have more stuff. We have more houses. So when disasters occur, we have more losses. And that is the primary driver. However, there is also strong evidence in various places that the hazards are getting worse. It's not just an exposure effect, it's also the hazard effect over time. Some examples of this is if you look at as I mentioned, the reinsurers earlier, if you look at the global reinsurance property business, they've made losses in 5 out of the last 6 years. So, that's either very bad luck or perhaps indicative of a trend. I suggest it's indicative of a trend, and that's led to substantial repricing in the reinsurance markets. Here in Australia, certainly a lot of the work that we do is showing that extreme weather events are increasing year on year. We produce something called the Australian Actuaries Climate Index. I'll stick links in there later on. And it's just showing the frequency of extreme weather is just getting worse, and there's a very clear trend of that. It's more difficult to do with insurance. You know, in many cases, these perils are 1 in 200-year events or 1 in 100-year events. And good luck if you're going to, you know, get some statistically viable information that's showing you that from annual information. Part of the quandary, though, is that we can't wait for 100 years worth of data to say, oh, yeah, there's really climate change happening here. We have to respond sooner than that. And that's where we need to move away from the statistics and perhaps place more on other lines of inquiry and other types of scientific evidence for what's going on.
Yeah. Your last report showed that there were about 1.6 million households in Australia that were finding insurance unaffordable. I'm going to change the question slightly here from what I indicated I was going to ask you, but what are the consequences of that? What does that mean for the industry if there are people who can't afford your product, or not your product, but the industry's product?
So, and that statistic was very much based on home insurance in Australia. It was based on looking at how many weeks worth of gross household income would it take to pay your insurance premium. So we estimated the insurance premiums across every of the 10-point-something million houses in Australia. We estimated household income levels using ABS survey data, and what we found was 15% of households had insurance that would cost them more than a month's worth of gross household income, which we think would be unaffordable. It's actually interesting. It's something we've tracked for 3 years. When we first did it in 22, it was only 10% of households. That grew by 20% to 12% of households in the next year, and it's now got to 15% of households. So, you know, it's increased by 50% in 2 years. And that's kind of what we expect to see, because, you know, when we look at extreme events and disasters, they're all about the tails of distributions, if I can put it that way. And your means might move a little bit, but even if your mean moves a little bit, the extremes move a lot more. So the number of households where insurance is a stress is something, you know, that we've seen in response to what's happened. Now, what's been driving insurance prices to increase is also really important here in terms of thinking about what it might mean for the future. So our analyses show that there's been 2 main drivers. About half of it has been because of the fact that building a house now costs a lot more than it used to. Buildings cost inflation, particularly during the COVID pandemic issues. Building costs went up due to supply constraints, due to labor constraints. And that is actually 50% of what we've seen in terms of the price increases. Now, hopefully that's a short-term effect, although there is a lot of evidence to suggest that climate change is likely to carry on stressing our supply chains and perhaps, you know, carry on driving spikes in inflation in terms of these types of costs. The second part of what we saw is primarily those reinsurance costs going up. Like, as I said, the reinsurers are making a lot of money, losing a lot of money, and they've rebased their pricing. Now that, if you ask the reinsurers, they would say that's because of climate change. Very clearly say, we can see this trend, it's happening, it's climate change, and it's what's driving up our costs, and they're passing those down. So that element of the increases, if climate change continues and there's no sign of us doing enough abatement to stop the effects we're seeing, we can expect to continue. I will add a caveat, though. The reinsurance market is very cyclical. It all depends on the flow in of capital and the flow out of capital on a global basis. Capital on a global basis is very nimble and moves very fast, and so we end up with these cycles coming up and down. So, for example, I think that perhaps reinsurance costs are coming down at the moment, and so we may see some relief for consumers in Australia and around the world in terms of disaster costs. And insurance affordability may not be such a big problem in the short term, but in the longer term, science, the evidence, and the lack of action is pointing in one direction.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and we'll come back to you in the discussion. I'd like to keep moving and bring in Deborah Tan, who's the CEO of Hong Kong-based CWR. Deborah and the CWR team have been leading thinkers on water risks and climate risks more generally. In fact, Deborah, I see that you've updated your website from China water risk to a new mission, Rethink climate, water risks and resilience. So congratulations on that. But first, perhaps a slightly more mechanical question. The sort of insurance industry that we've seen here, does that, do we see that sort of industry reflected in China and at the moment in terms of how it deals with, or does China deal with risk and insurance differently from what we're seeing in Australia and the US?
Thank you for inviting me here, Michael, and also for noticing that we've had updated our website. Yeah, we started off our life as China water risk, because that was about 15 years ago. There was great risk in China at that time, and 300 million people still had no access to safe drinking water. But, we completed that journey. And about 2018, we started looking beyond China and also looking beyond freshwater risks and to include sea level rise and so on, and coastal threats as well. And we really kind of felt, the name didn't really reflect what we do anymore. But a lot of the the bankers and financial industry that we sort of cope with and deal with were very attached to this name, China water risk. But we really felt with all these risks escalating, that we really needed to sort of change the name, because it's very hard to look at water risks without thinking about climate change, because it's really the flip side of, carbon cause water is mostly how we feel it. Of course, China is not immune to climate risks, right? And so insurance industry faces the same issues as everybody else around the world. However, I would sort of flag some things. China's the largest growing market. It's probably the second largest insurance market in the world at the moment. And it's growing probably at a rate, actually it is growing at a rate that is faster than GDP. And that's probably likely because it's not that deep, right? But that offers China an opportunity to do things differently as well. So, for example, in certain cities and towns and areas, insurers are actually working together with the town planners or the house owners to sort of step up resilience so that they can insure it at a reasonable price premiums. So this is actually happening a lot in China. And the thing that you also don't see, and this is on the adaptation front that you raised, Michael, earlier, is that China spends a lot of money on upgrading infrastructure every single year, right? Upgrading water infrastructure. Flood resilience, for example, is in the 14th five-year plan for water security. So there's a budget allocated to that from central government and also provincial governments and so forth. And so all this actually also builds resilience as they're building out development and so forth. And so to a certain extent, the infrastructure is already meeting the new, climate standards, as opposed to existing infrastructure, which you need to sort of upgrade. And so I think a lot of this money spent on infrastructure and shoring up flood resilience and so forth, or even coastal resilience against storm surges, like storm surge barriers now have to face 1 in 200 year storms, and all storm surge barriers have to be moved up to those. Those are not really accounted for as adaptation costs at the moment, or financing at the moment. And so those sort of remain hidden, but they do help the insurance industry. Now, if you look at Hong Kong, it's slightly different. China's massive, and so there's a lot of data and so on and so forth. Hong Kong is priced on an average insurance basis because we're a little tiny blob, right? And so even if property developers and so forth upped their adaptation, they didn't used to get a reduction in their premiums. And we really sort of see that sort of happening last year. So a very large REIT manager, Link REIT, faced flooding from the black rain that sort of happened in Hong Kong. And they basically updated all their floodgates, et cetera, across the entire portfolio. And then they had to go on an insurance roadshow, literally to the insurers, saying, look, this is what we've done and so on and so forth, to help them get comfortable with that. And actually they managed to get a significant premium reduction. And for the first time, the lead insurer actually insured for more than 1 year. So there is an upside in adaptation, and you can see that cost reduction the cost upside immediate. The payback can be quite fast.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because I know you do a lot of work with major businesses that are based in Hong Kong, businesses that have regional outlook, obviously, if not global. But is your sense that they're doing enough? I mean, do they get climate change, and are they taking adaptation actions?
I think it comes down to stress testing and understanding that risk, right? And so I think with the new standards that are the new ISSB standards that we all have to adhere to, and which will be mandatory, or different parts of it will be mandatory going forward. Even in China, it will be mandatory by 2030. There is a physical risk disclosure element. And we just published a report on the top 4 property developers, and it was quite interesting. So this is for coastal threat risk, so sea level rise and storm surge. And their properties are pretty much close to each other, and they're very similar revenue distribution. So, climate is a geographical risk, so we expected their risk profiles to be similar. So one of them said, we have very, very high risk, extreme risk to sea level rise and storm surge. The other sort of said, we have very high risk to storm surges, but we didn't stress test for sea level rise. The third said, we stress tested everything and we only have low to moderate risk. And the last one said, we don't have any risk at all. So you're like, how can your risk disclosure be so wide, right? When you operate in similar jurisdictions. And I think it was, because they used the wrong stress testing tools. So I think these climate tools are also, climate science is evolving very quickly. And so it's also very hard to sort of like get the perfect tool. And a lot of people like to use just one tool for everything, which doesn't work. I can sort of see Sranjit smiling over there. And so I think, so there's a tool issue, and there was also sampling size issues. Some of them did 200 over assets, and some of them just picked 8 versus their 200 something assets, just to sort of sample. But ultimately, it could cause a systemic financial shock, because the Central Bank of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, made 27 banks or local banks do a pilot stress test, and 27 of these banks stress tested their loan books, or their mortgage loan books, and they actually about a third, I think, off the top of my head, please don't quote me on this, I think it's like 28 to 32% or something like that, of these 27 banks property loan books with mortgages on it would be highly exposed to storm surge risks. And that was just factoring in 0.5 meters of sea level rise, which we know it's probably going to be higher sooner. And so it is a systemic shock unless we step up on adaptation. Now, I just want to flag for one of the property developers, and so we had to do our own stress test to sort of see who was really telling the truth and who actually got the numbers right and so on. And actually the one that matched our risks, they were acknowledging, there's only one of them that matched. And even for that one, they basically sort of said, look, our risks are really high, adaptation is really key, but the disclosure stops there. They don't tell you what they're doing. They don't tell you how much they're spending on that, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a good start, but we have a long way to go.
All right, fantastic, Deborah.
So I just wanted to flag that. Oh, I didn't talk about names, but the report is actually on our website, and the names are all there. If you want to
and the website from memory is
cwrrr.org. So CW and then 3 R's. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let's move right up close to where things are impacting. Heidi Turner is the CEO of the Townsville Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber's latest submission to the federal government was titled Market Failure and Insurance in Northern Australia. It was supported by 20 chambers of commerce across Northern Australia. And for those who don't know Australia very well, that's from the east coast to the west coast, about 2/3 of the way up the continent. So a big area. Heidi, what was the unifying proposition that brought all those chambers together?
But thank you, Michael. If you don't mind, I'd like to, as we're talking about insurance, I think it's prudent that we ask, what is a definition of insurance? Because that's something that always stumps people whenever I ask it. And to us, the definition is collecting the premiums from many to pay for the losses of the few. And that's not what we're seeing here when we're talking about insurance. Now that we have risk-based pricing for insurance, the definition seems to be very distant from those initial discussions that we're having today. If we don't have people participating in insurance because it's too costly, we have no insurance industry. So it kind of taps into what Matthew was saying earlier on. In your report, Michael, you mentioned that insurance costs rose in Australia in 2024 by 11%. But the reason we came together is because 14 years ago, after Tropical Cyclone Yassi in North Queensland, we saw increases of 300% and 400%. And that led to the Townsville Chamber commencing advocacy on what we knew was already a broken industry. And we continued to carry those industries into 2019, when the Australian Consumer Credit Commission for Northern Australia had an inquiry into insurance. And that again highlighted that the market failure existed. In 2022, Townsville Chamber had a big win with the one of their recommendations was a cyclone reinsurance pool. And that was announced by the then Prime Minister at a Townsville Chamber event here. But what unified us all chambers in 2024 and again this year was the shared recognition that there is and has been for some time a market failure in the insurance industry in Northern Australia. It's failing businesses, communities, economies, and hampering development of the region. So again, we've just heard the same from Matthew hours earlier on around the challenges in the US. So regardless of whether you're here in North Queensland, Northern Territory, or Northern WA, or anywhere in between, businesses are facing skyrocketing premiums, reduced coverage, or even the inability to secure insurance at all. This is not just a cost of doing business issue, it's a barrier to investment in economic growth, and in some cases, even business survival, as we're seeing from our neighbours who were extremely badly impacted by flood recently. So we all came together to call for urgent federal government intervention because the market as it stands is not delivering affordable, accessible and sustainable insurance solutions. And without change, the prosperity and resilience of our regions remains at serious risk.
I mean, people often don't think about this, but the connection between insurance and access to finance generally, I think, has been alluded to by previous speakers. But clearly, if you can't get insurance, you can't front up to a bank looking for a loan, whether it's to rebuild or to invest in expansion.
Yes, and to run a business, you also need insurance also.
Yeah. I don't want you to go through the whole report, so I know that you're positive and you proposed changes in the government-sponsored reinsurance pool for cyclone-affected North Queensland, and I see that that's being monitored by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. But it did find that price savings as a result of that pool were being overwhelmed by the growing cost base for insurance, and a lot of the issues that they mentioned were pretty much the same as the issues mentioned by Sharanjit. You proposed some improvements in terms of expanding the size of the businesses that can be included. You proposed that insurers be obliged by government regulation to offer universal insurance. You want taxes abolished on insurance, and there's been some commentary on that in the press in the last week, and a very good article in the Financial Review, I think it was, talking about the extent of those taxes, which can add about $1,000 or something to a home insurance. You've asked for greater transparency, and if all else fails, the sort of program that Matt mentioned earlier, a baseline no frills insurance scheme. But I wanted you just to talk a bit more about the final recommendation, recommendation 6 in your report on mitigation and resilience. In the conversation we had earlier, you acknowledged the importance of adaptation and measures that will reduce risk for your community. But you're sceptical about including mention of these in insurance policies. In other words, making the policies responsive. I'm just wondering if you could expand on that. Maybe I'm not just trying to work out, so the sort of measures that have been mentioned where you could be rewarded with a lower insurance premium if you've addressed certain risks around climate events. Could you explain the position there a bit more?
Yeah, it's not happening, which is why our fifth recommendation was around transparency and pass-through. So our recommendation on the only time mitigation should be mentioned really is for federal, state and local government planning and infrastructure. Attaching mitigation to individual policyholders is in most cases, to be honest with you, it's quite insulting, and simply it's used by the insurance industry to mitigate real solutions to the unaffordability and attainable insurance. Unless an insurance company can provide tangible reduction in the premiums based on mitigation efforts, it's becoming a smokescreen and delaying fixing the problem at hand to achieve attainable and affordable policies. Investment of taxpayers' money into mitigation should reduce those premiums. Otherwise, we're reducing insurance risk, funding dividends for shareholders and bonuses, and not actually reducing the cost of living for people in our region. Again, Matthew highlighted this earlier on, that it comes down to that social, I'll use his quote there, but he mentioned around social equity. Yeah, so that's why we're calling on the separation between mitigation and insurance pricing until there's real accountability and transparency in the way insurers calculate their risk reductions. If mitigation is going to be part of the insurance conversation, then we'd like to see insurers are being required to recognise and reward these efforts consistently. Until that happens, linking them to policy discussions, risk putting all responsibility on businesses and homeowners and those who can't afford it, within ensuring that they see these benefits. We can't keep hiding behind discussions on mitigation, because if mitigation technically is done really well, there's no risk and we won't need it. So that's a challenge we see around mitigation, is we really want to be clear that we want to make sure that any action results in a reduction in premiums. Even governments paying for mitigation is costing the general public money. So that's
which is a great segue into John Marinopoulos, because one of the projects he's been working on is the initial project has been largely focused on local government. But John, and you might want to just briefly explain that to us, but I'm speaking to John recently, you're also looking at the potential for modelling adaptation actions down to a household level. But John, maybe can I bring you in? Sorry, John is the principal of Value Advisory Partners, and he's been collaborating with CSIRO on a tool that can help target investment in infrastructure that can deliver the greatest value in economic, social and environmental terms. It sounds great, John, but can you tell us how it works, but also relate it to that point that we ended up with Heidi on just then?
Look, I'll cover that point off in terms of the specific data as well, just shortly. But in regards to sort of the issue of what we've been talking about, which is the sort of costs of insurers, etc. 6 years ago, we recognised with CSIRO, and they came to us because one of the key things we kept on finding was that everyone keeps on looking at these things by economic costs alone. They don't understand the sort of the broad value, what it does actually for communities, what's the actual inherent thing from the value at risk and the value potential. And so we've done a lot of work on value creation of multiple opportunities when things are in hazard and things are in disaster, and also things when they're not. And what we've done is we've incorporated that with a great deal of the data that was available on adaptation pathways that CSIRO put forward at the time. One of the biggest issues was really moving from that, as I said, traditional risk and economic management through to sort of coping with uncertainties through scenario analysis and decision making. So we built a framework all around that people can access, and it's actually available online as well. It's just a guidance document under a sort of academic printing that we've done. The principal thing about that sort of uncertainty and also that data, which I'll touch on, but is realistically, how do we combat the rising cost of those natural disasters? How do we address the risks of the hazards to assets? How do we, decide what to prioritise? Should we retreat or defend? Should we rebuild or build back better? Where should we invest? Well, will the investment case cause maladaptation? How do I receive funding? How do I deliver? Right, these are the sort of critical things, because I think a lot of the problems that we have is many people focus at that time. And by the way, Heidi's absolutely right. All the issues that she's highlighted, and we've done work up in Northern Queensland and South Australia and multiple other areas in the rural communities. Rural communities and regional communities are highly affected by this. It's okay in the urban settings because you can offset the costs at freight costs, as Sharonjit was saying. But Matt was talking about the costs in terms of wildfires, et cetera, and how they've escalated and almost exponentially over that time. So, the key thing we want to really focus on was how do we go off and make sure we can understand where private funding should actually go. How do we actually use that as a offset to government funding, and to be able to then understand sort of the risk context, the plausible futures. How do we assess and prioritize the options? What opportunities create additional value for communities? Don't just build it back just for the resilience of that approach. How do we actually make it adapt to the rest of the community in terms of what they do? Those broader, how do we avoid maladaptation, which has been, I think, one of the biggest issues. We've seen that with significant in Australia, 97%, the rule of thumb at the moment is 97% of expenditure is on recovery rather than resilience. That's a critical component of what we've got to do. And we've got to understand those detailed funding pathways to funding and delivery on an integrated basis. I think that point about integration is really critical as well, because there's too often we actually find that there's an analysis done here and analysis done on another side, and people try to bring them together. And it's very difficult, especially for people like reinsurers, to be able to have an integrated approach, or sort of a set of data or an approach where they can then go back and say, if I move that lever there, what does it actually do for that opportunity? So once we understand what we can prioritize, we can then decide what disaster risk reduction initiatives and those pathways we can follow and pursue. And that's, I think, really important for us. The issue about data is going to be critical. We've really been focusing lately on small area data. I think the biggest problem is Australia and many places around the world, data is still taken at a very large level. I mean, to give you an idea, economic data in Australia is still done when you want to understand GDP by different industries, and the impact is still done at the Australia level, not even at the state level, not even at the LGA level. So there's a lack of data available, and at the moment there's multiple organisations who are feel it's important to, or not feel, but they found an opportunity to be able to raise great funds and actually sell their data at a very high cost, which then means councils and others, especially people like Townsville, where Heidi's from, and also the Northern Australian councils, find it very hard to get good quality data to be able to then ascertain and analyse. Heidi's just clapped, by the way. Because we're seeing this all the time, and so but we're moving to different initiatives at the moment with places like the Centre for Disaster Management and Public Safety at Melbourne University, to be able to look at small-scale grids of hazard, risk, vulnerability, and exposure under multiple hazards. Where our aim is 10 kilometres by 10 kilometres in terms of the grids, which would make a massive difference to places like Townsville, because you could then see how that would differ all the way up to Cairns, etc. And that also would have a significant impact on the insurance and the reinsurance industry, because it would localize the effect, because then you could start understanding preparedness actions, disaster management actions that are localized and specific to those areas. And I think
which has been a theme through the work that Dan has led for NAPA, that climate change mitigation, we talk about 1.5 degree target. It's easy to talk on a global basis, but when you're talking about adaptation, invariably it's down to those small local areas, because each is going to be affected differently.
Yeah, and also, Michael, I think it's also the other part about it is there's it's amazing when you actually go down and you speak of the small areas like to councils, and someone says, "Oh, that's seawall," and someone says, "Oh, so what? So how are you?" They go, "Oh, we're all stuffed." You go, "What do you mean? What specifically do we need to change?" There's a lot of things that don't need to be changed to be able to build sort of adaptation. You can actually do them as BAU. You can look at certain assets to be able to operate. And Deborah was talking about some of the things that need to be scaled up in terms of other, whether it's seawalls, etc. But there are other things that are supporting that don't need to be changed. So how do we start looking? What we've been really focusing now is actually understanding projects or hierarchies of funding to be able to look at what is more at risk or less at risk during a whole program or a portfolio that you can look at. So you can actually go citywide, statewide, then down to local area, then project level, and then sub-project level, and to be able to then understand what those sub-projects are. So because if you then take a school, you look at now and you actually see how many of the schools in Queensland were actually underwater because they didn't have preparedness, right? And so there's like, okay, well, how does that mean you have to change all schools or only the ones that are specifically affected? Townsville, Heidi was going through a great deal of difficulty in the first, about a month ago. We know some of the people up at the Port of Townsville who literally had to change their whole asset allocation system because they had a master plan of 30 years and they suddenly went, oh my God, we've got to undertake resilience actions. So what, you think you would have
Well,
thought about that before? No, because the fact was people wanted to go and operate as business as usual. So one of the key things that people need to do is also think about the counterfactual outcomes.
Well, I was quite taken by the sentence in the Victorian government here in Australia just last week published a 30-year infrastructure plan. And when you turn to the pages on climate change, it actually makes the point clearer than I've ever seen a government agency make ever in my life. Says there is no funding for adaptation. The government has not allocated any funding. None of the managers of infrastructure we've spoken to are prepared to take any action because they know it's not going to be funded. Oh, that was an extraordinary statement, but it's true.
Yeah,
John,
we're talking to Infrastructure Victoria at the moment, and I think a lot of them have started realizing that there are more tools out there than what's been than what they see. But as I said, one of the biggest issues that we have seen and has really resonated with many people is a simple thing. How do you get people to think of assets go away from end of life to whole of life? That's a first pass. If you can do that, then your mindset starts changing. You think about that from a water perspective. You think about that from parks, natural areas. You also got to think of that in terms of cultural outcomes. We're doing also that with Indigenous people. But then there's get away from monetized benefits to diverse benefits. Once you actually go from those two, they're just two key pillar points that can actually make a big difference. And what we've also got to do is get away from what are showstoppers. The easiest thing you get at the moment is very simple. I'll just finish on this, Michael, where everyone says, oh, the data's not there. Throw your hands up in the air and move away. Okay. That's a critical major failing. And so what we've really, as I said, we really want to focus on how we can actually make small scale data visualization available in terms of hazards. And to be able to then, so one of the key things we've been adopting with Melbourne Uni's centre there that we talked about was how do we actually build a visualisation for the whole of Australia that's going to be free for governments, councils, non-for-profits, universities, etc., to be able to make sure they can access that information easily. And therefore they can actually have a higher baseline that people can operate from. And I think that if we can start adopting that around the world to be able to start giving people better baseline information that they can then also then go from, that will make a major change in terms of the way that people can think away from just traditional economics going through to thinking about things on scenario analysis and decision making and with uncertainty.
fantastic, John. I'm going to move to Greg because I want to allow enough time for questions and we've got to finish on time. So Greg, we saved you to last because of the wide sweep of observations from your report that sets it up really nicely for our discussions. Your report that you did along with other organisers was on the Miami-Dade Insurance Strategy Forum. So perhaps first just introduce the forum, how it came about, who was involved and what it hoped to achieve.
Thanks, Dr. Spencer, and apologies, it's 10 o'clock at night here and my brain is turning into pudding, but I'm going to do my best. So I'm calling from Miami, where I was born, I grew up. I'm a community organizer, so I'm still learning, and it's been great to listen to you all talk about this complex and urgent stuff. Informally, as a concerned citizen, I've been facilitating a book club in Miami for about 6 or 7 years, including local government folks and reporters and activists and academics. We've probably read 10 or 15 different books about climate change, sea level rise, how people process. We've read fiction, nonfiction, so on and so forth. And one of the members of our book club went from being a reporter covering climate change to working at Surfside's city government during the condo collapse. I don't know if that was news that reached you all, but buildings are falling into the ocean here in Miami Beach. And, she was working in Surfside during that time. And that sent her to London School of Economics to get a master's in risk management. And now she works at WTW, global insurance brokerage. I happened to be visiting London and we caught up and talked book club over breakfast, and I expressed some cynicism about the state of Miami's insurance market because on top of all the problems that you all are discussing, we also have the predicament of not only being a city that's at sea level rise or maybe 8 max feet above sea level, But also our ground is porous. Miami is built on limestone. So the water doesn't just come from the ocean to our east, it comes from the west, from the Everglades, and it comes from below. And, you know, even long before the streets are underwater, you know, our septic tanks are bursting and so on and so forth. It's a huge mess. And our insurance is increasing 20% a year, and people are starting to feel that. And so I was expressing some cynicism about the state of things to her, given all of the things that you all have been talking about, but even say worse in the United States, with less capacity to really think about ways that the government can play a role and so on and so forth. And my friend, who's much more optimistic than I, she was like, well, I actually think there's a lot of things that we could do. There's a lot of ideas percolating in the industry, in the insurance industry, and there's a lot of policy opportunities that we could learn from that have been tried in other places, but we have no place where people can get together and talk to each other. There's no space for the insurance industry executives and local government to talk to each other about what kind of data is needed. There's no space for local government and our statewide insurance regulator to get together and talk about like what's going wrong. And so that was something I can help with. I'm I'm a facilitator. I'm a process designer. So Kate Stein and I worked together to articulate a vision, and we brought that vision for a convening to our mayor's office. And we know the mayor. She's really great, Mayor of Miami-Dade County. And they've recently done some really good work, changing like stormwater runoff systems, doing things that like did actually have a measurable impact in our flood insurance rating that like impacted all county residents. So they'd had some wins, but property insurance is not something that they have any jurisdiction over. So they're like, okay, well, we've been looking to do something and we don't know what to do. So let's do this. Let's have a convening. And we brought about 70 people together from the insurance industry, reinsurance, actuaries, agents, universities, local government, state government, legislators, and insurance industry regulators. You know, the Miami-Dade mayor put out a call and people showed up. And we had 2 days, and the important thing, the principle that we brought to designing this event was very important, and this is maybe the most important thing I wanted to share with you all, and this is no shade on this particular event, but when you want to learn among many people about a complex issue, there is nothing less effective than talks and panels. People need to talk to each other. So we had 2 days, and there was not a single PowerPoint slide. There was like the mayor was the person who talked for the most amount of time, and it was a 10-minute speech, and she went a little over. I was not happy about that, but it was the mayor, right? But it was like 10 minutes was the most that anybody spoke in front of a, standing at the top of a room, speaking at a whole group. You need people to be able to talk to each other. That's how we learn. So we designed a process that would enable people to talk about the things they wanted to talk about in recurring cycles of small group discussions and sort of bubble up. What are the emerging themes? What are the opportunities? And we designed the events so that the agenda could evolve with the conversations. And what you see in the report that we have there is our best attempt to capture everything that came out of it. And there's a range of conversations that are ongoing as a result. And many of the themes reflected everything we've heard today so far, and I'm happy to recount that. But, these are very common patterns, even though every place is unique. So as soon as we organized this event, we started hearing from other communities who wanted to do things like that. I've been working with Boston. We are now advising groups in Southwest Florida, Tampa. So, I'm this is not my full-time job or even part-time job, but it does seem really urgent, like wheels of the civilizational bus kind of stuff. So I'm exploring to see, can we set more of a precedent for thinking about the design, the institutional design of spaces for people to work together. Because the most important insight that we found that I think you can hear from this conversation is that this is a pickle for which there is not one actor who can, slice and dice, right? This is a polycentric problem. And if we are going to find our way through the crisis, it's because we have many different actors operating at different scales in different sectors who are somehow figuring out how to coordinate their actions together. And we don't have institutional mechanisms that support that kind of coordination today. We have to find new ones. And so I'll just leave it there.
Fantastic. And I did, reading through the report, kept recurring to me how similar the issues and the challenges that you observed are to what we see here and in different parts of the world. Yeah, even your description of the problem could have applied here, could have applied for, could have been copied into Heidi's report or whatever. Very similar issues. And similarly, I think, the solutions you had, Heidi, if we think of the North Queensland Cyclone Committee report that was released last year, very similar issues again. It's about how do we make some adjustment, but then how do we think long term? And that long term, short termism was another theme I think came through, didn't it, Greg?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are a range of short-term actions that, could, I don't think fix the problem, but maybe slow the acceleration of premiums, right? Like there are standards for how to fortify your house against wind risks. And those standards are sort of promoted by small little grant programs by the state government. They could be required, right? The state government could be the state government could require property inspectors to collect data in accordance with those standards. Are the homeowners doing the things that the standard says they need to do in order to reduce wind risk? And then we could figure out, can we incentivize or require insurance providers to offer discounts, to support the financing and incentivize organizations. There are all these short-term things that could be done, and that was rewarding to come out of this process. And also, it was clear that long-term, none of this short-term tinkering will actually solve the problem. That it might buy us time, it might reduce the scale of the dysfunction, but ultimately we probably have to reimagine insurance as a social technology. And that reimagining is going to have to be a social process, right? There's
Yes,
not
but
going to be
also-
a program that does it.
Yeah, but also preparedness to consider things that Mark has referred to as retreat. Retreat from areas that are indefensible from the changes that we're going to be seeing, and consolidation in areas that you can defend.
Yeah, I was excited by some of the conversations thinking long term about how we could imagine an insurance that makes people whole after a disaster, but in a way where that land is not rebuilt, right? Either by government or by insurance policy. You get paid, you get taken care of, but you got to go, right? And that land gets returned. And then the question is, can we ensure that that land is then returned to the land, right? Or the water in our case, so that it's not rebuilt. Because that's currently the cycle, is that it gets destroyed and it gets right back into the real estate development game. And so we need to be thinking in those terms, which from this vantage point in our culture and America is almost inconceivable. But as things start getting worse, if we have these ideas on hand, when the next disaster comes, it might be easier for us to say, actually, we're going to learn our lesson. If we've already articulated, this is what a less foolish approach would look like.
Fantastic, Greg. Thanks for your contribution, and thanks everybody. Dan and Sharon, you've been monitoring the comments. What have you got to throw at us?
Well, there's some terrific comments. Mike, can everybody see the comments?
No.
No, okay. Well, let's see if from old friends Cheryl Wasserman and new friends Jonathan, Richard, and Alfred. Let me see if I can frame some, I guess we call meta questions. This is all about learning from comparison. The core report, which Michael and others we did, our core premise is that mitigation and adaptation are fundamentally different. Mitigation, we know we track every second parts per million of greenhouse gas. It's global. Reduce it a little bit in Atlanta. It's reduced by some measure in Beijing. It gets more complicated because of water and land. We know how to do it. Fossil fuel reduction. The fossil fuel market is global. The oil market is global, more or less natural gas. But here, as been pointed out, adaptation is local. You can have a flood, one neighborhood, not another. Depends on who lives there. So 2 questions for all of you. Matt, starting it off, Are we talking about insurance as a local, meaning here country or regional, or global? I don't begin to know about it, but we've all heard of Swiss Re. I mean, is it possible we'll never be able to have insurance in Miami or LA, but Melbourne will be fine because of the vagaries or luck of Australia, or is somehow Swiss Re the Wizard of Oz that will equilibrate? The second, and I was really struck by Deborah's comment about you had 4 companies, and each one of them, sophisticated companies, different risk analysis. A core finding, Mark Pisano will have comments on this, of our report is that the risk analysis for adaptation nowhere near ready. We don't have the forward-looking data. It's not spatially or temporally specific, and the local people don't know how to use it. So in all of this, from the perspective, Sharanjit, of the insurance industry, do people even know what they're doing? Not even to get to the question of this is mostly private, proprietary, owned by Elon Musk on Starlink. I mean, does anybody, there's, you know, oceans of data, but do any local people know how to use it? It's all going to be predictive. And are we talking about a problem which is useful and discussed as a global problem, or can each continent go its own way?
Okay, so do you want to lead off, Matt, Sharanjit, and
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, in a way, insurance and decisions about insurance and insurability are made house by house, business by business. And it's remarkable, and it's been true for many years, that when a carrier makes a decision about your premium, it's based on all kinds of things that are very site specific and more local than you might imagine. I mean, more local than just your neighborhood. It's about vegetation around your house and whether it's flammable, let's say in the case of wildfire, whether you have had a fire or damage your home in the past, et cetera, et cetera. Are you on a steep slope, and what direction are you facing? So, that said, when the insurance commissioner in California is playing this really difficult game of at once trying to protect homeowners, but at the same time recognizing that insurance companies they're not obligated to stay in the market. They can't be forced to stay. And so how do you attract an industry that's been leaving, either not writing new policies or just simply leaving the market? And so this push and pull of, well, we will now, in this heavily regulated market in California, enable insurance companies to use climate risk data to develop their premiums and their rate setting. But in exchange for that, we want to insist that they have to insure X percent of the market so that it deals with some of the equity issues. I mean, it's these sorts of constraints, and that's landscape scale, that's statewide in some cases, those types of decisions that insurance commissioners are going to have to make. So at once the industry needs to on the one hand, any given carrier and any given insurance broker that you talk to or insurance agent is thinking about something decidedly local, and yet they need to have the sort of wisdom to think about their entire book of business and all of their lines across, from the landscape scale to the state and beyond. They're even thinking about markets that are outside of the state that are less regulated, with the prospects of basically cross-subsidizing the more risky book of business that's in a state that has higher risk. Now, we have statutes in this state, in the United States, that are supposed to protect us from that, but we know that there's some of this cross-subsidization taking place. So that's a continental scale set of decisions that the industry is thinking about.
Okay. Sean, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, look, I think there's, if we zoom out from this, from a policy perspective, there's some really important questions and I guess value judgments that need to be made that, you know, that we can't leave to the insurance industry, frankly. We need to make it on a more collective level. So one of the most important questions is, what is the role of private capital in this whole business, right? You know, typically what we see is that, you know, we want to use private capital as much as we can, and that's why we have a flourishing global insurance industry, and that broadly can work well. But when you get social impacts that are perceived to be inequitable, then we see government step in and we see a nationalization. And then that's effectively what's occurred in Australia, that we've effectively nationalized the cyclone risk in the country under the cyclone reinsurance pool. And, you know, I think for many insurers looking at this issue down the track, really it's a case of, do you still want us? Because ultimately what's happening is governments are starting to replace, and, you know, in the US, it's a complicated picture with FEMA being involved and flood schemes and all those types of things. So, you know, I think we have to ask the question, what is the role of private capital? And that's a very important question. The other part to this, I think, is we have to struggle and answer the very important question about what is fair? What does fair mean, right? Because in insurance context, there's one which is, you know, everybody pays the same, like, and we do that in Australia. We do that for private health insurance. We do that for CTP insurance, where, you know, it doesn't matter if you're a crazy young male, 19-year-old driving around, you pay the same as, you know, a much older, smarter person, right? And we've made that decision. So that's one idea of fair. The other idea of fair is, if you have a bigger risk, you should pay more. Like, I mean, if you're living right by the river and, you know, you're going to get flooded more than someone who's at the top of the hill, you should pay more. Why should the person at the top of the hill be subsidizing you down the bottom of the hill, right? And then that's where we get into risk pricing. But those are all value judgments. You know, we have multiple examples of different ways of doing this in different countries and different states. And, you know, and the thing I would say is, it's not for the insurance industry to decide that, but it is for policymakers. Now, you need to really understand what this means. So, for example, if you want to do risk pooling and make everybody pay the same, you have to make insurance compulsory. So CTP insurance, third-party motor liability insurance, is compulsory in Australia, because otherwise what happens is you charge an average premium, the same to everyone. People who are lower than the average in risk, they stop paying in and they move away. And then people who are higher, the premiums just keep going up for them. And you know, yeah, sure, we can pool home insurance in Australia, but that means we would then make it compulsory that if you own a house, you have to buy insurance. Otherwise, that market wouldn't work. And, you know, so these kinds of things need to be thought through and understood and made in those kinds of frameworks. I think most importantly, especially speaking to this, is the role of adaptation and how we bring that to bear within this, right? Now, fundamentally, one of the problems with many of these risks is they're really unknowable, right? You know, like, I spend my time, and I think I'm very good at it, and I do a lot of business based on this, telling people what the risk of flood is at their house and cyclone and storm. But, you know, we're very frank. This is a best estimate that we're able to make at this point. The actual risk is unknowable. No one knows it. And to pretend that we do is kind of crazy. Now, the way that we manage that is we have a market, and people can say, well, this guy is prepared to take a lower number for it, I'll go with him or I'll go with her. But then you end up with problems that insurance is a complicated product and market information is not very transparent to consumers. So it's very easy to bounce around between all these policy decisions. And I love what Greg Bloom has done, and getting everybody in the room and smashing their heads together and saying, you know, come to this. But the last point I have to make about all of this is, there is a better world. There is a world where insurance is more affordable. There is a world where we can have adaptation and reduce the risk. The question is, who's going to pay for it? Like any policy decision, That's the lens that we should have around this. Who should pay for it? Should it be my neighbor who has less risk than me? Should they pay for me to be insured? Should it be the government, and so it falls on a taxation basis? Should it be all these kinds of questions? And a lot of solutions that I see touted around, they all sound great until we get to the conversation of who pays for it. And we need to start the conversation with that as part of the discussion. So those are my contributions.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Angie.
Michael, can I add to?
Deborah's got a hand up. Yeah.
Right. Just a couple of points here. I think, moving off a couple of people's comments from John to Greg, prioritization of risk, absolutely important, and nobody's really on the same page with this. But the good news is that because the slower moving risks, which are existential to most parties, like sea level rise or rivers running dry, those kinds of things are moving a lot faster now, and that kind of expands the risk. We're sort of seeing insurers as well as real estate developing associations and central banks getting together. So they're starting to do a cross-steering committee, but they're not throwing enough resources at it. So they are kind of starting to sit together. They're starting to realize the problem, but we haven't got enough multidisciplinary stakeholders in there. And ultimately they're moving not because it's a pure business risk, right? And they're attending to it as that. The other thing is that we do have a system in place, whether it's in Asia or in America and elsewhere, for earthquake risk. And for that, we've got building codes, we've got emergency response systems, we've got everything up for that, because we've just recognized that as an inherent risk. But going forward, if wildfires and floods are going to be inherent risks, then why don't we have also building codes for those as well, and it just stipulates flat across everybody. Look, if you're in a wildfire zone, this is what your building needs to look like, right? And it doesn't matter if you have more or less brush, et cetera, and that's just the cost. But we haven't done that, and systems do exist, but we're not thinking about it that way because we just still think that these event-driven risks will somewhat disappear in the future. But if they're really here to stay and they've become chronic, then we do have systems in place to respond to this. But we just haven't talked about it, like Greg sort of said. The last thing is that, on the unknowable risks, we kind of know some of these things on the broad front. And I think John was also talking about not maladapting. So quite interestingly, some years ago, we organized a panel on who is going to pay for adaptation finance, and this was led by the Singapore, government. And we had the National Coastal Threat Director open, and we brought banks and central banks, and then on the other side of the table, we had the town planners from New York and Singapore and so forth, and companies. And on one side, the town planners were all sort of saying, well, sea level rise could be 2 meters by 2100 if all this ice sheet melts. So that's what we have to keep in mind, right? So we would retreat from these areas and we'll plan accordingly. But the bankers were stress testing to 1 meter of sea level rise at most. So they were never going to be able to support the 2 meter planning people of sea level rise, right? So then we realized that the banks were not stress testing properly, although they've mandated to stress test at the worst case scenario, because there's a even worse case scenarios. So a lot of these are structural problems that will only get fixed if we're all sitting in the same room, and stop this kind of like specialization sort of, I'm in my own drive. But I think, the urgency of the risk is getting us there. But I think ultimately it's just down to knowledge. We just don't know. And we speak a lot to the cryosphere scientists because, for Asia, the number one concentrated risk that is a huge systemic shock is sea level rise. And sea level rise the rate has doubled in the last 30 years. And even a little bit is going to sort of like wipe us out. And so we're kind of producing these fact sheets. It's been a labor of love. It's like an idiot's guide for the financial industry on what's happening in Antarctic and also Greenland and so forth. And when we understand that, I think we can actually respond accordingly. And that's what we hope anyway. So I think knowledge and getting people in the same room and starting the conversation is absolutely key.
Great. Sharon and Dan, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Do you want to try and sum up some of the other comments? And I see Heidi's made a comment here while you're doing that, while you're getting ready to do that, restating definition of insurance, many paying little to support a few. And Matt's added, we still end up with equity issues. The stricter the building codes will price out lower income owners. So we're back at Sharonjit's point. We must grapple with who pays. All right, Dan and Sharon.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One, Cheryl makes the point of giving incentives for example, good action. Another deep question is mitigation and adaptation. Almost every climate plan in the world focuses on mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction. It's nice. You may get a reduction for that, but then you're still building your condominium on the Miami beach. So one is that. Another one is the point that's made, a bunch of points about risk communication, especially where, put aside what your average citizen like me might or might not know, much of this information is proprietary. There are billions of data sets. So this is just a complete, these are 2 points, 2 of the larger points. And finally,
Okay.
Matt raises the question of equity. My question back to Matt, do we know enough to even know if we wanted to favor everybody who is poor, would we know enough to know how to do that?
Do you want a 10-second response to that, Matt, while Oren and Mark get ready for a 2-minute comment on the discussion?
Dan, we're not allowed to talk about equity anymore in universities.
You mean even, I won't even say even in Georgia? No comment. No, don't say anything. Don't say anything, Matt.
All right. Okay, we've got to finish in 5 minutes. Mark, 2 minutes. Oren, 2 minutes.
First of all, I want to make a comment on an observation on several comments. John, you're absolutely right. Adaptation is place-based, and we need to start there, and that's where we need the conversation. Greg, you're absolutely right. Until we have actual institutions that have authority to do something on land and deal with the issue, we're not going to make progress on it. Thirdly, with respect to the issue of who pays and the role of insurance, if insurance is going to be private, then we need to recognize that regulating them, and Matt, the insurance commissioner in California, is absolutely driving the insurance market out of the state. And the approach that he's taking, and I don't know, they're now beginning to leave, and he will accelerate it because he hasn't figured out the issue of how do we make this how do we sort out the question of who pays? If it's government, we already have experience in the United States with flood insurance. It isn't working. We nationalized it. The rates got too high, and the next Congress reduced it. So the question of how do we in fact deal with the insurance issue? And Sharat, I want to come down. I hope I pronounced your name right. The question of who pays for it is how do we organize ourselves? And I'm going to use Greg, your notion. How do we organize ourselves and get the right institutional structure so that we in fact can capture the beneficial uses and be able to quantify it? And that means, and Michael, I'm going to suggest again, we really need a discussion on science. I know it's a word we're to abandon in the U.S., but we need a global discussion on how science can help us understand and make longer range decisions. And that's one of the predicates of the work that Dan and I have been doing. How do we in fact get the right science to be able to understand it so that we in fact can make, and I'm going to end with this, how do we make transformational change? Mitigation, Dan, you said it several times, isn't going to do it. We need transformational change in our government structures, and we need transformational changes in which the public sector and the private sector figure out how to sort this issue out. Otherwise, we won't have insurance, and the equity issue is only going to get worse.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. And I should have introduced Mark. Mark, of course, is the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Systems Panel at NAPA and a long-term senior public official in California. I'm going to let Oren have a final comment. Oren, of course, is, along with Dan, one of the leaders of this collaboration. So Oren, of course, is a internationally known scholar for his work on environmental governance and the Arctic. Oren, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. This has been a terrific conversation. I've learned a lot. I guess my takeaway from this is to wonder, as the impacts of climate change become increasingly severe, whether the insurance industry as we have known it is going to be able to make adjustments that will allow it to survive. I think we may be moving into an environment in which the kinds of actuarial calculations on which all insurance rests will simply not be feasible. And if that is the case, then what happens? Then maybe we are left in a situation in which either we allow people the freedom to do what they want, but no insurance. You do what you want, but you take the risk. Or we collectively as a society impose a lot more constraints or restrictions on what people are allowed to do. That is, where they can live, what kind of structure they can build, and so on. Both of those options are in some ways not very attractive, but it may be that those are the kinds of fundamental concerns that we're going to find ourselves navigating going forward as the impacts of climate change become increasingly severe and highly unpredictable.
Yeah, well, especially given the change in attitude of some governments around the world to climate change, the chances of us even achieving the rather pessimistic scenario of the last of 2.1 to 2.8 degree temperature rise are probably going to be overshot now. So Heidi, final comment. It's the gap between the actuaries and the final premium delivered, which is skewing results. So thanks, Heidi. Okay, it's 1:31 and Shahab told me that we may well be cut off if we go past 1:30 Melbourne time. So with that, all I can do is thank you all for your participation. Thank you for your comments. We will follow up with an email back to everyone. This has been recorded, so if you know people who missed it, you will be able to access the recording. We've been exchanging a lot of documents between each other here. Hopefully Shahab knows how to keep all those links so we can capture all those documents and send them around to all the participants. The other thing is this has been a set of 3. We are currently planning another 3. Hopefully NAPA will want to continue the partnership. And we will be keeping the website open and moving forward with those 3 that are coming up. And, you know, they'll be spaced about 6 weeks apart. But we've really appreciated the network that we've put together so far. And our aim will be to do a better job. We'll adjust time so that people like Greg and Amanda and Dan aren't sitting up at 9 o'clock at night. So thanks, everybody. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to all the participants. Great contributions from everybody. Thank you.